Now, we're excited to have Ardath Albee, CEO of Marketing Interactions, taking the stage. This industry veteran is going to share how you can start moving the needle with content marketing.
Hello, everybody. So, it wasn't too long ago that I spent a lot of time convincing people that they needed to do content marketing, that they needed to invest in it. And it took a bit of convincing. And then people started publishing things about why companies needed to become publishers, why we should start thinking like media companies, and how we could now publish content on blogs and social media and other channels. Most of us, after a while, bought into the dream. And I'm pretty sure just about every one of you in this room also bought into the dream. And so we started creating content, and we started publishing it. People started reading it. And we invested more and more time in it, and we started getting really caught up in how do we engage with our customers and our buyers. And so we got really far into this whole thing, and we've invested a lot of money in it. Most of us use content marketing. I can't imagine what the 7% that say they don't use it are doing. Most of us have somebody in charge of it, even though a majority of us don't have strategy in place. We're using a lot of tactics. Where most of us are using 6 social media channels, and pushing content out there. And year over year, we're creating more and more content. And now we're putting more and more budget behind it. So here's the big deal. Now what I'm getting is calls from people that are saying, we did all this stuff. We're really far into this. We bought into the dream. But nothing's happening. It's not working. People are reading our stuff. We're getting lots of views. We're getting lots of shares and lots of clicks. But we're not selling more. We're not seeing pipeline momentum. And in fact, Adobe did a survey last year, and only 9% of marketers strongly agreed that their digital marketing was effective. That's a bit scary, don't you think, considering how all in we are, that only 9% said that we're effective, or that their digital marketing was effective. So we keep digging this hole for ourselves, and part of it is because we haven't really figured out how all this works. Content marketing is not about publishing content. Content marketing is a practice and a discipline that requires process and support to make it work well. Okay, it's not just about pushing out content. And so we need to get ourselves out of the hole and keep moving forward. And the reason why this matters so much is because the number one fear that most marketers have, according to research, is they're terrified that they're going to be unable to reach their customers. So think about that. How scary would that be if you ended up unable to reach your customers? And the other reason why it's so important is because 66% of us now think that a digital strategy is the only way to go, that without a digital strategy, we won't be able to engage with our customers. And I think they're probably right, considering the amount of new channels and what everybody's doing these days. So we really need to think about how do we fix it? So we haven't been doing content marketing all that long. Although people will argue that it's been around forever, I don't think we've actually been doing the practice or the discipline that long. And now we're already saying, well, it's broken, let's fix it. So I think we need to really start paying attention to what this strategy means. And we're not changing enough. So you heard it earlier from Brent when he was up here talking about customers have changed. And that's the biggest thing we all need to deal with. Well, they have. Unfortunately, we haven't really. And so buyers care about content that's relevant and valuable. They care about ideas and expertise. They care about learning how to solve their problems. They care about all of those kinds of things. And they keep saying in research repeatedly, quit pitching us. Support your content with research and data. Prove that you know what you're talking about. And instead, what we keep doing is we keep talking about our products. I've had clients sit in a room and argue with me that they were actually talking about what their customers cared about when they were talking about their products, which is not true. It's what the products enable that they care about. We still talk about our features and our companies and everything else, and it's not our fault. It's what we know to talk about. We're totally invested in our products. We get the value, and we want everybody else to be as excited as we are. But they're not. What they care about is what the products enable at the end of the road. And we have to get better about how our content addresses what they care about. And the first thing that we really need to think about is, how are we different? What is our distinct value? Now, in most organizations, when you start thinking about positioning and you start thinking about, it leads you to start thinking about mission statements and taglines and all those kinds of things. And usually when we do that, we're thinking about them in relation to our competitors. What sets us apart from our competitors? And every time I think about that, I always think of Avis that came up with "We Try Harder," to get ahead of Hertz. But who cares, really? It's not about that. Our distinct value is the intersection of what we sell with what our customers need. It's all about our customer. And if we don't start positioning ourselves and defining our value in relation to what our customers want and appreciate, then we're not going to make this work. We're not going to get their attention. They're going to move on to somebody else. So we need to really pay attention to what our company's strengths are in the eyes of our customers, and we need to do the research to find out. And I'm going to give you an example of what's different between corporate speak and customer interest. And we all know the world's leading provider thing, and I'm going to pick on Xerox here for a minute as an example. But if you look at their About page, what it says about them is that they're the world's leading provider of business process and document management. Who cares? But if you look at the home page of their website, what do you see? You see a question that asks you to consider how Xerox can simplify your business in ways you might not expect. Now that's interesting. That makes you sit back and say, well, what does that mean? How could they do that? And then if you're looking at their homepage, you see choices of different ways you can find out what they do. And it's a lot different than saying, we're the leading provider of business process and document management, right? So we need to think about the difference between what we do and what our customers get. So here's an example from Teradata. They say they are the leading provider of data warehousing and big data analytics and marketing solutions. Well, there's a clear definition. But when you go to their website, on one of the sliders that's going by, they have this really cool graphic, and it says, when the world gets smaller, the data gets bigger. And then there's a question, what would you do if you knew? Which is pretty compelling. And you start thinking about all the data, and you start thinking, well, hey, what don't I know? What should I know? And you get interested in thinking about it more. But it's just this idea of flipping the positioning, the messaging around to talk about what people care about in relation to what you provide or what you sell. And we need to really start thinking that way. Now, anybody who knows me knows the first place I'm going to go is personas. And personas take a lot of flack. Man, they are kind of the whipping boy these days for content marketing. And one of the reasons is because there are some really bad personas, and personas need to be active tools. If they aren't active tools and they aren't helping you inform messaging or architect stories, or accelerate momentum, then they're not doing their jobs. And they should be kicked to the curb, I agree. But we have to think about them as active tools that inform the strategy that we all need to support this process of content marketing, okay? And just to be really clear for the purpose of this session, a persona is defined as a composite sketch, right, that of a target market that includes the commonalities that you can dress across them in relation to what they care about that you can impact, right, that what you sell. It is not a real person. Now, I get in discussions with marketers that say, well, I was talking to Harry at our customer X the other day, and he didn't say that. He said this other thing over here. Well, sure, there's going to be all kinds of Harrys and Sams and Davids, but what we need to look for as marketers is what are those commonalities that they all care about that gives us a way to reach more people, because that's our job as marketers. Until we can get to a one-to-one perspective, we have to focus on what we can impact. And so we need to care about the commonalities, right, what we can address. And so we need to think about what a difference that can make. And so I want to talk to you about the elements of an active persona for a minute, because I want you to really think about what you can do with these if you have them. Now, the first person scenario is really one of the most critical pieces, and it's the piece that I would suggest you create last. What it is your persona talking to you in first person voice about a day in their life. And they're saying, in the role that I have, these are the things I go through on a daily basis. This is what I'm trying to achieve. This is what's getting in the way and really pissing me off. And this is who I interact with about that, and I really wish I could convince so-and-so to do X, and whatever. But it's a day in the life. The reason it's so valuable is because it allows you to step into that person's shoes. And the reason that matters is because you're going to be creating content for this persona for months, years, whatever. You need to be able to recapture that. It's not just about when you do the research originally. You need to be able to step back into that, but even more importantly, you're going to have other people writing content for this person. You need to be able to hand them something that allows them to get to that place. And so really important. The next thing, objectives, orientation, and obstacles. Objectives, of course, obviously, what they need to achieve, their priorities. Orientation is when you get to kind of the few of the human details that you can suss out that are common. And one of the best tools or things that ever became available to us as marketers is LinkedIn, in my opinion. Because you can search for and use advanced search to find profiles of people that represent your persona. And you can read what they personally write about themselves, what they're interested in, what groups they belong to. You can find out if you look at 100 profiles, on average, how long has the person been in that position? Do they tend to stay in the same industry? Do they tend to stay with the same company and work their way up? You know, what are the commonalities that stick out to you? You can find groups that they participate in and see what they say and what they're responding to. You can learn all kinds of things in addition to the interviews and the other work you do to create personas. There's simply no reason for us not to have this information. So we need to look at things in orientation like, you know, do they all have engineering degrees? That may tell you a little bit about how their brain works, you know. Have they been in their careers for a long span of time so they know where all the bodies are buried so they can probably help facilitate consensus for a deal? You know, look at things like that. Are they brand new in their career? And they may not have a lot of clout, but they might be willing to take a bigger risk to make a name for themselves. What are those things? You know, and obstacles, of course, are anything that can derail the deal. What can stop it cold? And it's not just price, okay? It's an influencer who can say no. It's a priority reallocation that steals budget. It can be a ton of different things. An incumbent vendor that saves himself at the last minute. It could be a ton of things. What are all those things? And why would people say no? We need to know. Because if we can circumvent those things from happening earlier in the process, then we have a chance of getting more salespeople into those conversations before people decide you're not for us, or we're not going to change, or whatever. So as marketers, we have to start being more proactive and looking at what else we can solve since, as Brent pointed out this morning, they're getting so much farther through that blue arrow without us. So we have to figure out how do we get ahead of that. Problem presentation is important. Problems are the flip side of objectives. You may know that your persona needs to use a very broad example, increase revenues. Do you know why he's not? What's in the way? If we don't know what problem's in the way, how can we possibly talk to them about how they can achieve that objective? We need to find out. And then we have questions. And questions are really critical as far as I'm concerned, and I want you to think about questions. There's a lot being said about questions, and one of the easiest things is go find out all the questions that your buyers have and answer them, and that'll do it. No, it won't, because there's no structure to that. Questions and answers are like conversations. Think about it. If you have a conversation with somebody, what happens? You walk up and you say, "Hey, Joe, how are you?" And Joe says, "Ardath, I'm doing great. What's going on with that project you're working on with Sally?" "Well, you know, we ran into some troubles with the research. Have you seen blah?" Whatever. Did you notice? Question, answer, question, answer. It's a rhythm. And it allows you to learn what you need to know. We need to start using questions to do that in order to construct flows, right? And make sense with our content so we can figure out how do we create more engagement over time? How do we connect the dots? Because they're not going to go look for how to connect the dots. If you don't show them, they're just going to move on and go find something else. And then finally, we have engagement scenarios. And in this day and age, I would argue that those are one of the most important parts of a persona. Because let's say, okay, you've done all this research, you know your persona, very familiar with them. You got this guy nailed. You're going to create your content. Then what are you going to do with it? Where are you going to put it? What's your distribution plan? And it's not just a distribution plan, it's how does that back and forth work? Question, answer. How is it going to look? What channels are you going to use? If you publish a tweet and they click on the link, where do they go? Then what happens? Then where do they go? You've got to start thinking about how are they going to put the pieces of this story together in order to get where they need to go. So let's talk about Pete, our product manager. So this is a brief little example, a little bit of a first-person scenario. And what he's saying is, as the product manager of a mature category, he's really struggling because his product is not as appealing anymore, so he's getting a lot of churn. He needs to figure out how to lessen the churn, get people to extend renewals on the product, that kind of thing. And he's really a little bit pissed off that Harry, his colleague, has the cool and sexy product. And he's really challenging himself to say, how can I make my product be as good as Harry's product? What do I need to know to improve the product, extend customer life cycle, what have you? And then below that, you see some of the things we just talked about. And so we are going to say, how do we use questions effectively? And so one of the things that I want you to consider about using questions effectively is the difference between big questions and small questions. So if you think about Pete, our product manager, his big question really is, how do I increase renewals for his product? And if you think about the way questions work, that's a big question. There's a bunch of smaller Q&A that happens, the conversation that goes on before he gets the answer to the big question up at the top, right? So for example, small question, how can I get customers to keep using X? You know, what product, how do I figure out what product improvements I should make? Those kinds of things. And so there's going to be a series of small questions, and there could be a lot of them, a variety of them. And we need to figure out what those are. And then we need to figure out what sense does it, what order does it make sense for them to be presented? Because if you think about a question and answer flow, and you actually go through that process, it will become very clear that if you're asking and answering questions in a way that actually makes sense. Now, before anybody says anything about this, I know prospects aren't going to go through this process linearly. But here's the thing. We have to figure out how to structure the entire story. Then we can publish it and connect all the dots and allow them to experience it however it makes sense for them. Hopefully we can guide them to do it in the way that through research and trial and error we've learned really helps them figure all this stuff out faster. But we can't create that whole story unless we use some kind of a structure to do that. What we need to remember is we need to help guide them through it, but we need to allow them to choose their own adventure, if you will, choose the way they go through it. But we can't do that if we don't have it all out there, and we haven't done the work to create it. So we need to think about how that works. So when we're doing this, we need to think about that dialogue I was talking about. How does it work? So, if Pete's thinking, how can I get more customers to use, to keep using X? And then he gets a piece of content that talks about how adaptive guidance can help increase customer retention. And I should have mentioned, by the way, that in this scenario, you are actually selling a software product for contact center agents interacting with customers. Okay, and we're talking to Pete to get his vote and his influence in getting our software into the contact center. And the reason why I wanted to present Pete is because he's not an obvious choice. An obvious choice would be to present this scenario and have you go after the contact center manager, right? Who might be, or the contact center ops person who might be making this decision. But the thing that a lot of us don't think about is Pete's one of those people that could either make or break a deal. He could say no, and that might not have that much effect, but Pete's got buddies in other areas of the company that could say no, and then it does matter. But if Pete really wants it, and Pete can really understand how it can increase customer longevity and lifetime, and profitability and sell-through and those other things, and he starts going to battle for you and sharing your ideas with the people that need to reach consensus, Pete can make a big difference. But you might not think about Pete. We need to start thinking about people like Pete. And we need to start thinking about how we influence them and how the dialogues come together. So The next thing I want to talk to you is story. I want to get really clear about story for a minute, because I've been reading a lot of stuff that says, everybody's saying storytelling in B2B is the way to go, forget about it. It doesn't work, it's wrong, whatever. I've read a lot of posts like that, and then I read posts that say, storytelling is great, and then I'm not quite sure that they know what they're talking about when they start explaining what storytelling is. So let's just kind of clear it up a little bit. A lot of people think storytelling is when your executive stands on a stage and shares an anecdote, and that's telling a story for your company, and that's one version, right? Another version is case studies. If they're done well, yes, they tell a story. What I'm talking about when I say storytelling for B2B is the story of the entire experience from one end of the buying process to the other, from status quo through lead gen, through all the steps they have to go through to become your customer, and then also as your customer. But let's just box it into that first part. We need to think of story as the beginning, middle, and end, right? The story that we tell over the entirety of the process. Where we get hung up and we get stuck is when we think about story as one piece of content. And it can be, but I would argue that even so, it is a piece of the bigger story. And we have to start putting together all the pieces of the story. This is one of the reasons why you'll hear a lot of people talking about content marketing saying campaigns don't work. And I'm one of them, and I'm right. So listen to me. Campaigns don't work because they have start and stop dates, okay? So they have, on one client project, there's a VP that comes into the room during our quarterly meetings, or I should say on the video call, and says, hey guys, what's the theme for this quarter? And I used to try to explain to him that it wasn't a theme, it was a continuous process, and we were continuing the story. No, what's the theme? I just want to know the theme. So pretty soon we decided we would just give him a theme. And he would be happy and he would go away and he'd continue to fund the project. And it's still working today. And the reason it's still working is because it actually works, and they're actually delivering good leads, they're selling more stuff, he's getting all the credit, and he thinks it's all because of his themes. So sometimes whatever you have to do. But sometimes it's a lot of change, and like I heard Brent say this morning, it's not just change for your customer, it's change for you. It's change for the way we do things and the way we think about things, and we have to get really clear about it. So let's talk about what story means from beginning to end of a buying process. Now, one of the things that drives me crazy is when there's discussions out on social media channels, which I see, and somebody says, who's the hero of the story? And some marketer types in, my company. My product. And I just want to, but I just don't understand how it's even possible that there could be any thought when somebody says, who's the hero of the story, that it's not your buyer or your customer. I don't get it. It can't possibly be. And so we have to get really clear. And once you get clear that the hero is the buyer, the story kind of falls into place, especially if you've done persona work to create the active tool of a persona. So think about this for a minute. The hero, who's your buyer, has a problem, and something disrupts his status quo, and all of a sudden he comes up with that big question. I really need to go out and achieve this big thing. Heck, how do I do that? It's what all of us go through when faced with a big thing, right? So then we decide, okay, let's go take a look around and see how we do this. Let's go figure out how to solve this thing. Can't be that hard. And we go out there and we start looking around. And this is sometimes known as the call to adventure for the hero. Any of you who have ever done any fiction story structure? And so he decides to start looking around. And he does. And then he discovers he lacks expertise. He has no freaking clue what to do. And he thinks, God, what am I going to do? And then he starts coming up with these smaller questions as he sees bits of information. And he starts asking those small questions I was talking about. And he starts getting information back. And you know where he's getting that information from? He's getting it from you, because you are the mentor that he needs. If you think about it from a fictional perspective, what story do you know where there's not a mentor helping the hero figure out how to get the girl at the end, the happily ever after, whatever it is, that's the goal. Simple example, Cinderella, fairy godmother. So they're learning from you, and then arguably every story has a black moment where either all is lost or he's going to get to the happily ever after, or she is. And in a B2B story, that's arguably whether or not the committee gains consensus. If everybody's all in and they say yes, woohoo, they're going to buy your stuff, achieve resolution, and live happily ever after, right? If they say no, it's over. So that's the climax point. So if you look at it this way, it's simple enough to see that it is a process. The story extends across the duration of the buying experience, and we need to facilitate that. And we do that by being a mentor. We don't do that by being a pushy salesperson. We don't do that by talking about our products. We do it by helping our hero get to his goal, right? So we need to really think about how do we structure our content in a way that together it creates this story over time. And one of the reasons we need to do this is we need to help our buyers get to that goal. We need to help them resolve it. And so we need to get everything else out of the way so they can get to the cheese in the middle, if you will. And the only way we can do that is if we can create enough engagement because we are relevant and valuable enough to them that they will extend their engagement with us over time. And one of the reasons this is really critically important is because if they extend their engagement with you, they ingest your ideas, and if they're great ideas, which I know they are, then your buyers take those ideas back into their companies, and they share those ideas with their colleagues as they're walking down the hall, while they're on coffee break, when they go to lunch, when they're in a meeting. So you need to start thinking about your content as a Trojan horse. So we always think about it as we need to use content to get our salespeople in conversations, to get us in the conversations. One of the things we really need to do in addition to that is get our buyers in conversations. How are they going to talk to each other? If you have, one of the things the research shows is that there's more and more buyers involved in the buying process. And if they're not able to reach consensus, you have no deal. So if we can start getting people to share information and ideas, our ideas, then we are arguably in the room. So we need to really think about how do we achieve that. And one of the things that we need to really understand is that all of those people have to talk to each other, but we may not be able to reach all of them. So every time I go on a project, I guarantee you that one of the personas that my client is going to want to create or say they have to have is a C-level. And since most of my clients are tech companies, everybody wants a CIO. And quite frankly, in the last 3 years, I believe I've created 82 personas over 15 or 16 projects. How many CIO personas do you think I've created? Anybody? None. You want to know why? Because none of the companies sold something that was important enough to be of primary interest to the CIO. Everything we discovered when we did our research said the CIO would either delegate down and have somebody else do all the research, build the business case, come back, present to him, and prove it to get him to sign off. What we find most of the time is whoever we think is our decision maker is not really the person we have to reach, not in a B2B complex sale. It's the people that are doing all of the eval and research. And if they love you, they're going to get you in the door. They're going to get your salesperson in front of their CIO or whatever. And it doesn't mean you don't need content for that person. What you need is to inspire the directors or the managers or whoever's doing all the research to grab that white paper that's written for your CIO and give it to him and say, I really like this company. Here's some information that I think you'll find valuable. We need to facilitate the sharing of that information amongst that consensus group. And so the thing you need to consider about personas is, it's all fine and dandy to create them, But if you create them and dedicate resources to addressing them, and yet you cannot reach that audience directly as a marketer, you're wasting your time, I would argue. And I've done this enough times to know that if you get the right group of personas, you can still influence that person. And you can still get your salesperson in front of them. But you can direct your marketing resources to something much more valuable, which is getting the attention, time, and engagement of those people actively really involved, right? And they will share your story if it's a good one. And so we really need to start thinking about how we're executing, how we're developing our strategy, and who we're really trying to engage. Because oftentimes, it's not the person that signs on the bottom line. It's the people that are doing the research. Sometimes it's even, end users get involved. Everybody else gets involved before the decision maker finally, he may come in and out of meetings, but before he really sits down, talks to your salesperson and gets involved with your company, everybody else is in there. So as Brent Adamson talked about that 57% of the way through, are you going to wait until they're about 80% of the way through when that CIO is ready to talk to vendors? Or are you going to get in there back in the beginning when you can influence ideas, right? And work with the people who are actively involved. And I think we need to start looking at this whole buying process a little differently. And as marketers, we need to say, you know what, salespeople, we respect that you want to talk to the CIO. We just may have to get you there a different way. We may have to get you through the director or through the VP or through whoever. Because quite often when you ask marketers, why do you think you have to get the CIO? Because our salespeople say that's who they need to talk to. But if they're sending marketing out on this mission to get somebody who they can't engage because that person is not interacting in the channels or interested in the evaluation, then we're not helping our company. So we need to really have those conversations with sales and say, look, given all of our research, all of the interviews, all the stuff we found out, these are our best chances at engaging people. Here's our pathway to get you to that person. Here's how we're going to build out content to help with that. So we need to start thinking about how we're going to make it all come together. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about metrics, because accountability is one of those things that is elusive. And part of it is because a lot of what we're measuring doesn't tie to the outcomes that we need to have. So at the end of the day, I don't care what anybody says, but clicks and views are not going to tie to revenue because they're just not representative of it. But they're also not going to help marketers achieve their goals. So there was some interesting research that came out recently by Chartbeat. Some of you may have seen it. They analyzed 30 billion web visits. And what they found is 55% of visitors to the web page spent less than 15 seconds on that web page. 15 seconds isn't a whole lot of time. But it's also what they found is that irregardless of how much time people spend on the page, there were a lot of people sharing that content, whether they read it or not. So those of us that think clicks and views and shares are important may need to rethink. We better start measuring time on page to find out, did they click and run? Did they click share and run? Or did they read? And how much did they read? Because it's important. If they're only spending 15 seconds on that piece of content and you have 3,000 views and you think, oh, this is really killer, man. This is going to make a difference. We're going to drive some leads with this sucker. And they're only spending 15 seconds? I don't think so. So we need to really start thinking carefully about what we're measuring. So I would argue that time spent on content is important. I would also argue that the reason why we don't move the needle in marketing is because we don't tell anybody what to do next. Or it's a terrible ask, like request a demo. So we need to tell people what's next. So if we're working along the theory of this is storytelling across the experience and they engage with a piece of your content, what do you offer up to say, hey, here's the next piece. Here's what's coming after. Click on this to find out more about this topic that you are interested in. We don't do that. In fact, 9 times out of 10, when somebody calls me and said, hey, we bought into the dream and it sucks, I go out and look at their content, and there's no orchestration of progression. There's no ask. There's no call to action, whatever you want to call it, there's not. And so what? They go read your content and then what? You expect them to go do an archaeological dig to figure out what's next? We have to start connecting the dots. We need to know if you put a piece of content out there on a particular topic and you have a couple of links to the next pieces of the story and they click on those, doesn't that tell you a lot more than if they come read the piece of content and go away? How much interest, what is the level of intent behind their interest? Somebody who spends a lot of time reading information about a particular topic is more interested in that topic. Now, if you were to present links that go to a variety of different topics and they start moving around, I would argue they either don't know what they're really trying to solve yet, or they're looking for that other thing. They thought the first thing was it and it's not. But we have to start looking at their behavior, and we have to set it up on our pages and the way we're presenting content to provide information to us. So when we're looking at what somebody's reading on our website, we can say, hey, they're interested in this topic. Hey, they're interested even more because they clicked on the next piece of the topic. Hey, they're interested even more than that because they registered for the webinar we showed on the page after that. How are you going to gauge level of interest? It can't be random. And it's not random, I would argue, if somebody is actively pursuing solving a problem and buying something. You want to look at frequency. How often do they come? Do they come only when you email them? Or do they proactively come back to your site, your blog, your whatever, on their own because they're interested? Big difference in the two, right? Are you top of mind only when you hit their email box or their Twitter stream? Or are you top of mind for them when they're thinking, hey, I need to learn more about X? Which is it? So I would argue we need to work towards the latter one. So we need to think about what measures of engagement will help us really define movement in our pipe. How do we get more leads from form completion to qualified status? And I have to tell you that I was a bit appalled when I read the research done by BuyerZone that found out that 50% of marketers, when asked, at what point do you send a lead to sales, said, as soon as they fill out the form. Come on. We have to get beyond that kind of stuff. We need to think about response. And I'm going to share an example of this with you. But anybody who is using a do not reply email when they send out their marketing emails, and they do, I get them in my inbox every week. Why do people do that? Seriously. When we're communicating digitally, what makes you think that a reply is not important? And it is. And in most of my clients, we get responses. We get thank yous. We get replies. We get questions. We get requests for specific content topics. And it's important. We need to think about it. Who's posting comments on your blog? One of the things that bothered me about this big controversial thing that came up where Copyblogger turned off their comments, and Jay Baer's now doing it, and a couple other people, is, and I get their point, sort of, but for a B2B company especially, why would you cut off any avenue that your prospects have to communicate with you? We should be encouraging it. Quite frankly, we don't get enough interaction on our sites. And so, it's fine for what those other people are doing, but you need to figure out how to encourage more. People who are willing to take the time to read your content and post a comment, or people willing to ask a question at the end of a webinar, are much different in their level of intent than people who just stop by to read and leave. One of the things I do when I'm researching personas and working on projects is I go sit on the webinars that competitors are holding. Not so much because I care what the competitors are saying, but you know what I want to know? I want to know what questions get asked at the end. What aren't they covering? Or what really stuck out for their attendees? I want to know if there's something I can use for that. I want to know if there's something I'm missing. So that's what I look for. You also want to encourage sharing with peers. B2B buyers share a lot of content. and especially considering the number of people in the buying committee. And one of those things I talked about earlier, where you might not be able to reach the CIO, but you can reach the director, we need to make sure that we put content that's suitable for the people that they may need to share content with in front of them, so that they're not sharing content that was written for them, but probably not really interesting to their boss or whoever. We need to figure out how to facilitate that. We need to make sure that there is zero effort involved for them to share content. That's something we don't do really well yet either. So we need to think about that. Intent is really important. There's a big difference between somebody who shows up and reads and somebody who shows intent. Like I said, a concentration on a particular topic, spending time really digging into it, reading everything you have on it. The pace of progress. As we measure, one of the things we have to do that is exceedingly challenging, and I think why this is such a difficult thing for a lot of us, is our companies run on a monthly or quarterly timeline. They expect us to report, how dare they, about what we're doing. And we have to do it faster. So if you have a 9-month or a 12-month sales cycle or buy cycle, which a lot of my clients have, we have to figure out how are we going to report something compelling that really shows we're kicking butt, and all the quarters that are before that. And especially until you get that momentum happening where you have stuff closing all the time because you've driven that and you're continuing, right? We have to be able to figure out how are we going to report on this stuff. So we have to think about how are we going to measure. Well, marketing automation offers a lot of options. And one of those options is the ability to define stages of buying, right? And then measurement of who moves in and out of each stage during a period of time. One of the things that I would encourage you to do, and it's why I did this when I wrote my first book back in 2009, is break up your buying process into a number of stages so that you're measuring smaller chunks of time. If you have a 12-month buying process and you have awareness, consideration, purchase, you got a span of time that's longer than a quarter for each stage. What good does that do you? By the time you know whether your marketing is working or not working, you're already behind the gun because you've waited so long to find out. So we need to be able to figure out what's working and what's not working really fast, as close to real time as possible. And that means shortening up stages so that you can see, movement or non-movement and how long people are staying in one place, and you can take action, insert content, or do something to get them to move forward. So we need to be able to prove that. And finally, we need to look at the pace at which your prospects agree to have sales conversations, and initiate that. At the end of the day, it's about revenue. We have to get our salespeople into conversations. But the argument I'm making here today about moving the needle is we cannot just think about campaigns. We can't think about, okay, this guy filled out a form, toss him to sales, we're done now. Who needs all this great content? We'll just publish more mediocre content and keep driving those form completions or whatever. We can't do it. We have to start looking at this as a continuum. We have to start addressing the entire process. And as we do that, by the time your buyers get to 57% of their way through, they're going to be thinking about you. You're going to be on the short list because the content that they've been accessing during that 57% of the time is going to be yours, because it's so relevant. The one thing Brent didn't say this morning is what they do during that 57% of the time. They're researching, they're gathering content because they can, they're making out. Why can't it be your content that they're engaging with during that 57% of the time? That's what you need to really think about. Here's an example, and I started to talk about it, the idea of the no reply email and why we should never do that. One of my clients has a really, really long sales cycle, and they sell outsourced contact centers, which is millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars per year. And so it's a really, really long cycle. And so what we found, though, is that we get a lot of interplay on email. So we get, like I was talking about, we get replies. We had, for example, an executive that had been on our nurture program for a long time. And she had been engaging with everything we were sending. And we were seeing, multiple accesses of articles and different things. And finally, we got the send person on our nurture emails is our inside sales team. So each rep is responsible for a particular number of leads. And we got an email the rep did. And from this executive saying, she's getting promoted and she's been sharing this content with 8 people on her team. And they were terrified that they weren't going to get the content anymore, so they all wanted their names added to the database. That's a gift, And it also goes a long way to saying how much value they're getting in the content. So that was great. Another example, one of the inside sales reps got a reply from one of her people that said, hey, I really like this article on X. Have you ever thought about writing an article on Y? I really want to know about this particular perspective. We'll have it right out for you, buddy, And so it went into our plan and we created that. And we got good response from other people as well. We got a lot of thank yous. One of the best ones for them, because of the length of the cycle, was when an executive forwarded the email to one of his directors and said, go research this and find out about it. We need to make a vendor switch. And they got in a conversation. And here's a really good example of the decision maker handing it off. In this case, he was in our database, but he is handing it off. So there is a lot of reasons to stay on top of that reply box, for the email address that you're using to send your nurture programs. And I would suggest that we keep on top of it. I've worked with marketers where nobody was watching, and it just piles up, whatever it is. So think about that. The other thing is what I hear these days in regards to moving the needle is that everybody's getting stuck in the middle of the pipe. So marketing's doing a great job of lead gen, right? We're putting out some good white papers and hosting some great webinars and what have you, and everybody's getting stuck in the pipe because they're signing up, so they're going in the database and then they don't move. They just sit there. Well, I just worked on this project for a recent client, and what we did was we discovered that there wasn't any reason for them to do anything because nothing was connected. So they signed up for a webinar on a specific topic, but unfortunately there was no other content on the editorial calendar and the plan around that topic. So everybody who came to that webinar had no other reason to really engage with the company if that's what they were interested in was that topic. So the company wasn't thinking about how to connect the dots. It was just going, oh, this sounds like a cool topic. Let's have a webinar. Let's write it, a white paper. Let's do whatever. And then these people got interested and they were left hanging because there was nothing to build on any of it. And so this is why you need a strategy. This is why content marketing is a practice and discipline. It's not just publishing. So before I leave today, I just want to refer back to a couple of things. The first thing you really need to do is figure out what your distinct value is. And then you need to review your personas and make sure that they serve you as active tools. They need to have all the parts to work. If they are not informing you about messaging and how to architect stories and those types of things, your personas are not done correctly, and you need to do the research and the work to make it so. And I can't emphasize how important this is. In fact, the first thing I say when people hedge at personas and say, oh, we know our customers. And I'm like, really? So you need me because? Why? But the thing to me is, when I think about it, how would, when some of them ask me to just do the work without the personas, and I think, how am I supposed to write for somebody I don't know? If I don't know what they care about, I'm just throwing a dart in the dark. You have to know who you're writing to and what they care about, or it doesn't make a damn bit of difference. So we really, I know personas are controversial, and I don't care if you want to call them profiles, audience, dossiers, whatever you want to call them, but you need to do the work to get that information and get to know them well enough that you can step in their shoes and really talk to them. Because being relevant is, you have to be that. That's table stakes. And I don't know how you do it if you don't know who they are. You want to isolate your big questions and start figuring out what those dialogues look like. Go back to, and when I'm telling you to turn campaigns into stories, I'm not telling you to throw your campaign stuff away or any of your other content for that matter. What I'm saying is, think about this from a dialogue perspective and go back and look at your content and say, okay, how could we arrange our content or organize it in a way that we're facilitating this type of dialogue, right? And what would it take to do that? And do we need to refresh or revise the content to make it really work in that way? But there's a lot you can probably do with what you have. by no means should you reinvent the wheel, but you need to approach it differently. You need to have a strategic approach and a process for how all of this stuff works together. And I would argue that as we add tactics and channels, it's just going to become more complex. So the faster we can get a handle on it now and the better we can get at it, the better off we're going to be. And identify metrics for you that show movement, depending on how you execute programs and the types of platforms you're using and the types of programs you are executing. Your metrics may be different than those I showed, but think about things that measure engagement, that measure intent, right? Where you can keep track of a response and react to it quickly. Those are really important things to be able to measure, and ultimately you have to tie them to revenue at the end of the day. So I hope I've shared something with you that will help you speed people through your bicycle or their bicycles faster, and I thank you very much for your attention.